Today's lesson is Lesson 10, War Rages On. Henry Ford, the innovative car manufacturer, once said, "Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right." His point was that a person's attitude has a huge impact on how much they do or don't accomplish in life. As you study the Revolutionary War, you can see how true this was for the British and Americans. Confidence and momentum played an invaluable part in the battles of 1776 and 1777, and ultimately gave the Americans the upper hand in their fight for independence. Where we pick up the Revolutionary saga today, the Americans and British are embroiled in the depths of war. Let's take a moment to highlight some of the major events that have occurred in order to understand where the two sides currently stand. If you can picture a ping pong ball bouncing back and forth across the table, it gives you a fairly accurate image of the victories and defeats during 1776 and 1777. The siege of Boston came to a close on March 17, 1776, when George Washington and the Continental Army occupied a high area of Boston. They used the cannons taken from Fort Ticonderoga to force the British to flee Boston Harbor. The fighting spread beyond the New England area. Americans had success as they prevented attempted British takeovers at Moores Creek and Sullivan's Island in North and South Carolina. A major blow came for the American cause in September of 1776. When the British captured New York City after a series of battles. They would remain in control there until the war ended. Soon after, Philadelphia was taken by the British as well. Things were looking bleak for the Americans at this point. After losing New York City, their army was in shambles, and soldiers were deserting the Continental Army in droves. Morale was at an all-time low. To save their new nation, they needed a victory. An activity break would be do you remember the cannons that were taken from the British when the Green Mountain Boys captured Fort Ticonderoga? There were over 100 of them, and they played an important role in ending the siege of Boston. Fort Ticonderoga is over 200 miles from Boston, and the story of their transport is pretty amazing. Look up the Fort Ticonderoga cannons and see what you think. The Northern Campaign, 1777. War is all about strategy, and British General John Burgoyne came up with what he thought would be the ultimate plan of action. Britain would isolate the New England colonies from the rest of the United States. They would accomplish this by taking control of the eastern edge of New York. Remember, New England was the epicenter of the rebellion. Separating its many passionate American patriots from the other colonies would slow communication between the states, stop supplies from being transported, and prevent troops from moving freely back and forth to defend one another. Burgoyne was so certain it would work, he made a bet of 50 gold guineas that he would beat the Americans within a year of time. At first, it looked like the British would succeed in their daring plan. They recaptured Fort Ticonderoga and took the Fort Edward as they slogged through the swamps of the New York's Hudson River Valley. Patriots did their best to make the British march as miserable as possible, cutting down trees across roads, destroying bridges, and slowing progress any way possible. 40 bridges had to be built on the British march to Albany, where they planned to meet up with 2 other detachments in order to complete the offensive campaign. The battles of Saratoga of 1777. Beauharnais and his men never made it to Albany. They met up with American troops led by General Horatio Gates at Saratoga, New York, on September 19th. The Americans took advantage of the location by using guerrilla tactics. They clashed in battle in an open field encircled by woods, climbing trees and shooting down at the British. At the end of a day of brutal fighting, the Americans retreated. As the first battle of Saratoga ended, there was no clear winner, and over 100 lives were lost that day. General Burgoyne believed he would receive reinforcements within days, but they never arrived. So on October 7th, he decided to attack again. The Second Battle of Saratoga left no question as the victor. The Americans triumphed over the British. 10 days later, Burgoyne surrendered to the 2,000 Americans who surrounded his troops, and the Americans had their badly needed victory. This battle has often been called the turning point of the Revolutionary War. The confidence of the Americans was bolstered, and they had proof they could hold their own against the legendary British Army. Yet the war was far from over. 6 more years still lay ahead, but the more immediate concern was the coming winter. The winter at Valley Forge, 1777 to 1778. George Washington took his men to Valley Forge outside of Philadelphia to wait out the winter of 1777. Due to the harsh weather and difficulty of travel, there was little military action in the snowy months. The Continental Army was in high spirits after their victory at Saratoga, but it was still in terrible condition and desperately short on supplies. About 1/3 of Washington's men had no shoes to wear. It is said that when they had to be outside, those who were barefoot often stood on their hats to keep their feet out of the snow. Many lacked warm clothes and blankets. The log cabins, which were hastily constructed to house the troop, were filled with smoke for their fires. There was often very little food. 2,500 men died from hunger, cold, and disease that winter at Valley Forge. Can you imagine the dedication these men had to the cause of the Revolution to withstand such extreme conditions? Even in this horrible situation, Washington was able to keep the morale of the soldiers amazingly high. He accomplished this by keeping them busy. Washington recruited General von Steuben, a Persian, to take charge of training the Continental Army. They spent the winter training and emerged a much more organized and professional army. Although Washington could have left Valley Forge, he remained with the men and walked with them through the difficult time. He even brought his wife. Remember Martha Washington and her camp visits? She was at Valley Forge too, knitting socks for the soldiers as fast as she could. Spring brought with it better conditions in the camp. Because of Washington's strong leadership at Valley Forge, the Americans came out of the grueling period stronger and more committed to their cause. It's hard to believe that the Continental Congress would allow the situation at Valley Forge to exist, but the truth is the Congress often struggled to provide basic supplies for its army. Throughout the Revolutionary War, the new nation did not have sufficient funds to pay its soldiers and supply them with the essentials. In addition, it lacked a good system for distributing the supplies they did have. Help on the way, 1778 to 1779. While the Americans had not given up, the fact remained that they were under-equipped, outnumbered, and desperate for help. Behind the scenes, Benjamin Franklin had been hard at work on a plan to procure that help. If you remember, Franklin spent the last years of the war as an ambassador to France, doing all he could to persuade King Louis the 16th to join Americans in the war against the British. With this victory at the Battle of Saratoga, the Continental Army proved they were a real threat to Britain. This was just the nudge France needed to join the fray. After signing the Treaty of Alliance and the Treaty of Amity and Commerce in 1778, the French provided assistance to the Americans in the form of money, supplies, and manpower, sending soldiers and warships to fight alongside the Continental Army. The following year, Spain, too, became an ally of the Americans by declaring war on Great Britain. This was a serious issue for the British. They now had the two extremely powerful enemies of France and Spain to contend with, as well as a revolutionary to quell. In truth, the French had been helping the Americans with supplies since before independence, but the official treaties in 1778 increased their aid. The Spanish and French were not really motivated by their interest in America's cause. Rather, their reasons were mostly selfish. Britain had dominated colonization. France and Spain had lost considerable territory after the French and Indian War. If they sided with the Americans, it would be a blow to the mighty British Empire and would hopefully increase their chances of regaining some of their lost territory in the future. Whatever the French and Spanish motivation, their involvement was the reason America began the next phase of war with renewed determination. The Americans had proved themselves worthy of adversaries of the British at Saratoga. They came through the miserable war at Valley Forge stronger and better trained and had new allies sending relief in the form of troops, financial support, and supplies. The Americans were ready to move forward despite serious setbacks because they had the confidence to think they could. Let's talk about it. Can you think of any ways the Congress could have kept their troops better supplied during the early parts of the war? And why do you think the supplies were low? How do you think the war might have been different if France and Spain had not been involved? This concludes our Lesson 10 for today.